Thank you. So good morning, everybody, and welcome to our October webinar, The Trends That Will Impact Our Workplaces and Buildings in 2022. I'm delighted to welcome Steve Kellett of Argent LLP and Rob Harris of Ramadus Consulting, who will be giving us their views today. So next slide, please, Joe. So Rob Harris is principal of Ramadus Consulting, an independent built environment research and advisory business, and he has over 30 years experience specializing in real estate research and consulting. His interests range from workplace to city region, and they're driven by a common theme of demand-led research. Rob works with property investors, developers, advisors, and policymakers, and advises on corporate occupiers directly, preparing corporate workplace strategies. He's currently the chair of the BCO Research Committee and has published extensively for BCO, City of London Corporation, Federation of Small Businesses, and the Investment Property Forum, and the Mayor's Office, and the RICS, quite an extensive list. Welcome, Rob. And Stephen Kellett is the Sustainability Manager for Argent LLP. Steve has been working extensively on the regeneration of King's Cross over the last couple of years, and he has responsibility for driving environmental sustainability across their activities at a corporate and project level. Prior to this, he has experience working in sustainability roles with MACE and CBRE. He sits on the UK Green Building Council's member advisory group and lectures at the University of Westminister. So welcome again, Steve. So Joe, if you could move on the slides, please. So just to introduce myself, for those that don't know me, I'm John OBrien, the MD and founder of LCMB. And at LCMB, our mission is about creating better working, learning and healing environments for our clients. Thank you, Joe. Next slide. And the objective for today is to discuss the trends which are likely to impact our workplaces and buildings in 2022. So before moving to our panel discussion, I'm just going to share, again, next slide, please, Joe. I'm just going to share our 5 predictions at LCMB for 2022. This is taken from a blog we published, which is accessible on the website back in September of this year. So just to say a little bit about, I guess, our view before turning to Steve and Rob. So firstly, COVID secure working. It doesn't seem to be going away anytime soon as the pandemic continues to sort of impact our way of living and our life. And our thoughts are we're going to have to continue to think about creating and operating our workplaces in a COVID secure way through to at least the end of 2022, perhaps before we get herd immunity in the UK and elsewhere. And building on that, we're seeing a lot more emphasis in terms of employee health and well-being, particularly the current government health and safety drive, and also SAGE guidance around ventilation control, and optimizing ventilation in workplaces. So that's a specific driver, I guess, from the COVID secure working and the sort of knowledge we've got about reducing transmission of COVID and other issues over the last 12, 24 months. It's coming to the fore, and our view is that theme is likely to continue with a drive towards more emphasis on the environments that we create for our employees and workers in the workplace environment. And clearly, we've seen a huge drive towards the road to net zero carbon. We've got COP26 coming up in a short while in the UK and Glasgow, and with organisations such as the NHS in the last 12 months committing to delivering net zero by 2040 to 2045, we're likely to see continued investment, emphasis, and policy driving us to design and operate our buildings in a much more sustainable way, and working towards achieving a net zero carbon performance in terms of embodied carbon, operational carbon, and end of life carbon. The other really interesting thing, I guess, as a consequence of both Brexit and COVID, is that we're seeing a fight for talent, most visibly, I guess, recently in the fight to acquire HGV drivers. But that's manifests itself across many areas, and perhaps there's an opportunity for us to think about how we design and create our employee experiences to be able to deliver better support for talent acquisition and retention in organizations. And then clearly, like many sectors, the impact of the Internet of Things, which are wireless sensors, artificial intelligence, machine learning is starting to disrupt our buildings, the components that go into our buildings, and starting to support flexibility and working in new and exciting ways. So those are some thoughts from myself and the team at LCMB. They're available in the blogs on our website. And I'm now going to turn to our panel, to Rob and Stephen. Thank you, Joe. If you just stop sharing the slides. And so, Rob, I'm just going to start with yourself. Can you say a little bit more about your role and responsibilities for the design and management of workplace buildings and estates, please?
Certainly, John, thank you for the introduction. Yes, well, you mentioned my role as chair of the BCO Research Committee, and that says what I do in some senses because I'm a researcher, first and foremost. So we're looking across the whole life cycle of buildings from design through to delivery to management to occupation. I've spent 30 years now from a research perspective understanding all those processes that happen within the real estate cycle. I also do hands-on practical work in terms of advising clients on their workplace strategies at a briefing level. So really it's evidence-based advice to clients, research-based advice to clients. That's really what I do.
Okay, thank you. And Stephen, a little bit about your role in terms of design and operation of buildings and workplaces.
Yeah, so as you said in your introduction, my main focus is on King's Cross, which is a large-scale regeneration project, and we also have a few others, namely one in North London called Brent Cross Town, which is at the really early stages. So what we do, we're a developer that doesn't just focus on one building. We do large estates, and we build the buildings, but then we also manage them afterwards. So we have quite a long-term interest in how they actually operate and manage the tenants within them. I guess the thing that makes us unique in terms of workplace design and how we think about buildings is that it's not actually just the buildings, it's the spaces in between them and how people during their lunch break can go outside, how do they get to work. So that's, I guess, the different aspect we look about health and well-being and office design. It's not just the building.
Okay, thank you, Steve. So back to you, Rob. Before we start talking about 2022, what do you think have been the biggest trends and impacts on buildings and workplaces over the last sort of 12 to 24 months? Maybe obvious, but really interesting your view.
Oh, gosh, where do you start? Well, despite the photograph you showed of me at the beginning there, John, I'm old enough to have lived through several signature moments in real estate, reaching right back to Big Bang in 1986 through several recessions, 3 or 4 recessions, I think, 9/11, the global financial crisis. These have all been big moments in real estate with change. But I can honestly say in all that time, I've never experienced anything quite so profound and disruptive as what happened in March 2020. And it really has changed things enormously. What it's done, first and foremost, of course, it's demonstrated that distributed work can happen and that it's practical. I've been advising on agile working now for 20 years, but it was always an uphill push, whereas now we've demonstrated beyond all doubt that working from home can happen. The question, though, is, I suppose, well, there's a couple of questions. Firstly, are we dealing with an experiment or a crisis? Because if we're dealing with a crisis, that's one set of responses. We go back, hopefully, to doing what we did before. If it's an experiment, we learn from it and do things differently in the future. So that's a big impact for me. The second is that the crisis has called into question, in a fundamental way, the role and purpose of the office. Now, I've been studying office now for a long time and recently written a history on it. And in March 2020, 200 years of evolution just stopped. Because we knew where we were going at that point in terms of the changes in the office, but suddenly we don't. So we've got the whole issue of experiment or crisis, the role and purpose of the building. And I think thirdly, I'd like to add in terms of trends and impacts, the crisis has called into question the very relationship between the firm and the individual. Is a job now a contract, or is it a life-serving purpose? What's the relationship between an employer and an employee? Who's got the strength? Who makes decisions? How do you manage culture and equity in those situations? So I think there's a whole set of questions which arise out of this, which are yet to be resolved. But in terms of impact, I'd say those are the key things for me.
Okay, thank you, Rob. And Stephen, from your point of view, what do you think have been the biggest trends and impacts over the last 12 to 24 months?
Yeah, I mean, it's quite hard to put it any better than how Rob has. But from our perspective, it's just even more of a focus on quality. It's not an obligation to go into the office. Yeah. Before, when thinking about a job, I guess the office was secondary to the purpose of a job, and you knew you'd be going into the office more or less no matter what. In our kind of sector, obviously there's different sectors which aren't in offices, but from what we're talking about. And so we've always prided ourselves on designing good quality offices and understanding that you actually want it is somewhere where you're spending 10 hours a day. You want to be there, which we knew, and we sell offices, so we like to think that we know that. But now everyone else is appreciating that it's not. There can be differences between good offices and bad offices, and places where you want to go, and importantly, where you want to go more than your home. So I guess that's the biggest trend of an appreciation that there is variance in the office quality.
And Steve, just a sort of secondary question, at the beginning of the pandemic, there was a lot of talk about the office being dead. I think it's been resurrected perhaps in conversation or discussion or response to the pandemic as it's waned. Do you think we've categorically concluded the office is not dead?
I'd like to think so. I mean, yeah, to my mind, I think people will still lease office spaces, but rather than putting one person every 6 meters squared, they'll make it a bit more breathable. It'll be one person every 12 meters squared. So actually the size of the office might stay the same, but rather than having like rows and rows of desks, it might be somewhere more, well, nicer and like a bit more varied. So that's my positive outlook. And equally, from going back into the office, I certainly see, the different levels of conversation that you can have in actually meeting colleagues, that if you're going to confine yourself to working 5 days a week at home, you're going to lose friends, you're going to lose colleagues, you're going to lose promotions. It's not going to be particularly pleasant for you, and you might get slightly bored working from home, and you might be able to do it for a little bit, but ultimately it will affect your lifestyle, in my opinion.
Okay, and Rob, do you think we can conclude the office has got life in it yet?
Oh, without question, absolutely without question. We'll learn how to use it differently, as Steve suggested there. But I think I'm a geographer by background, so I understand how cities work first and foremost. And you can't imagine cities emptying of office buildings. I mean, it's just inconceivable, really. And we also got to be very careful here about taking an Anglo-centric view of these things. In Asia and Australia and America, there's a very different way of looking at the way that we'll use offices in the future. So we've got to be very careful that we don't just take our own, island culture here as the model for all offices worldwide. So no, definitely a future.
Okay, thank you. So turning our attention to 2022, Steve, do you think 2022 is likely to be a continuation of 2021, or do you see any major sort of difference?
It just feels like more or less everything is getting towards normal. Like people are going at, like every restaurant seems to be busy. The difference seems to be, well, everything seems to be busy. I get on the tube and it's still busy, maybe not quite as busy. But then you go inside the offices and they're not as busy. So I don't know where everyone's going. So to my mind, it feels like it will stay relatively similar to how it is now, but just more and more people going into the office rather than 1 day a week, going 2 days a week or 3 days a week. But I don't see many people, like literally no one I have spoken to is ever suggesting that they'll be in 5 days a week. But what I am hopeful of is when you choose to go in the office, even if it's 2 days or 3 days, on those days you choose to go out for lunch or you see your friends in the evening. So in terms of our expenditure on going out and events might not change too much, but what might change is just the percent of occupied desks in an office, which doesn't particularly matter. But if I were managing offices, I'd probably look to understand how you can change those workspaces to make sure they're working for everyone a bit better. So maybe you'll see a lot more investment in, when things have calmed down and people understand what the future might look like, redesign of offices, because a lot of people probably have had enough money to invest in changing them at the moment, and not knowing what the future might hold have probably put off a lot of projects. So maybe we'll see a lot of refurbishments in 2022 and changes in that manner.
Okay, thank you for that, Steve. And Rob, from your point of view, do you see 2022 as a continuation of 2021?
I've had some fairly robust conversations with people on social media who kind of like want to paint March 20 as year zero. And I fundamentally disagree with that, because I see what's happened over the last 18, 19 months or so as an acceleration of some things that were happening before. We were talking about health and well-being. We were talking about agile working. We were talking about the talent war. All these things pre-existed before COVID, but as Steve said, they've become accelerated. They've become more acute and more established. So I think that's the first point. And the second is, in terms of continuation versus difference, as Steve said, we're moving to some 3-2 model, Tuesdays, Wednesdays, Thursdays, whatever you want to call it. But we have to think about how we're going to manage buildings in that context. And this is my change point. Going into 2022, we've got to start thinking as a real estate industry how we manage buildings. We cannot afford to have empty buildings 4 days a week. It's nonsensical in sustainability terms. So we can't shut buildings on a Thursday evening and open up on a Tuesday morning. So we have to find a way of managing diversity in buildings. That's the real big change for me. And how we manage footprints, and as Steve said, the different kind of work environments for different kinds of activities. So you have big changes at that level.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry, just to that point, one final thing there. There's a lot of discussion about designing a new office, and your spread of questions here, John, is about more than that. And I think we don't need a design agenda, we need a management agenda. How are we managing space differently in the future? Not how we're going to design new furniture or new layouts, but how we're going to manage this place to best effect.
So I think we're seeing sort of more of the same incremental change on what we've seen, but perhaps some interventions thinking about how we utilize space more effectively, deliver better use of the space, better experience. So moving on moving back to COVID, really. Rob, do you have a view as to how the pandemic is going to play out over the coming sort of 12 months? Do you think more of the same, or will it be different in any way? Or
John, if I did, I wouldn't be sat here. No, seriously. I emphasised the uncertainty in my opening remarks, and that is still around. And I see that as going on through at least till spring 2022. I think this is a 2-year disruption, not where we are now. Things are getting better. Steve's right. I was looking at some data from TfL a few days ago, and journeys are up. London offices are running at about 50% occupancy apparently. So things are gradually returning. But I think that uncertainty will be with us until at least 2022, and perhaps going even into next summer.
Okay. And Steve, your view, do you think the pandemic's here to next summer or later?
Who knows? I always thought we were like 3 months away from everything being normal. So it's and it feels again, we're 3 months away. And to be honest, most people can go about. Obviously, there's the unfortunate few who can't go about things too normally. But I think a lot of people have just put it in their risk register as like an ongoing concern, in the same way that if you drive a car, you might crash, but it's an accepted risk. And I think once you've been double or triple jabbed, it's just something where you take it as a risk and just continue with your life. I haven't seen too many people not going into work or not going out because of COVID concerns. There might be some instances where some people still feel like they can't go to a big event or a nightclub or something, which is understandable. But actually going into the office, a major concern of people is that some just can't be bothered because they've decided to move 2 hours away, and now they're like, actually, I don't want to commute for 2 hours. But that's a few people who have decided to make that decision, which may or may not prove to be short-sighted. So off that, actually, the people that have decided to move out of the city centre and move into the suburbs and have very long commutes, maybe we'll start seeing a lot of job changes in the next year or two, where actually if they've moved, I don't know, to Oxford, they might get a job in Oxford rather than commute into London. And a lot of bigger companies might open up satellite offices or have some more flexible co-working spaces dotted around the country, which would be exciting. But yeah, I can't see it being particularly sustainable, not from an environmental perspective, but from a lifestyle perspective of having to make ridiculously long commutes all the time.
I guess if we take the most optimistic view, there's some current forecasting that suggests the COVID numbers might come down dramatically over the coming weeks, based on improvements in vaccinations and a bit of herd immunity. I guess if we see that, it'll move us in one direction. If we see an increase in COVID over winter and maybe a sort of pressure on the NHS with flu, it might move us in another direction. So let's hope we see a dramatic reduction in COVID cases over the coming weeks, and we can move into spring and put COVID and the pandemic behind us. That would be my hope, and I guess Boris's as well at the moment. We'll see. So just moving on then from the pandemic, Rob, do you think we'll see an increased pull from employees and policy legislation driving us towards healthier offices based on the experience of the last year and a half?
Without question, but I'd go back to the point I made earlier. We were doing this 24 months ago. Health and wellbeing in the workplace was very high on the agenda then. It's going back to high on the agenda now, because we need to provide workplaces. Steve was talking earlier about places. Work and place go together. We need to provide a place that people can work in and feel comfortable and healthy and secure and productive in. And that's the key point here, that we need to provide workplaces that all those things can happen. But that's a continuation. It's not a new thing, but it is hugely important now. And the ability to choose is as much part of that well-being issue as anything else. And frankly, telling people you can work Mondays, Tuesdays, Wednesdays, or Tuesdays, Wednesdays, and Thursdays, that's not flexible. That's just saying you're here 3 days and you're there 2 days. That's not a flexible work pattern. That's just a way of reducing your footprint, frankly. So how we deal with choice at that level is the key thing, I think, because people will begin to vote with their feet and be where they want to be, as Steve said. I'm not a great believer in the hub and spoke model that Steve referred to, because I don't think any single employer has sufficiently dense employees in one location where they can afford to set up a hub. It works in America. If you're in San Fran or something, you can set up a hub in one of the big burbs and it works because you've got hundreds of staff there. But in the UK, European context, I don't think it works. You can give people subscriptions to a serviced office or something, which is fine. But what I fear more than anything is we're going to end up, instead of 1,000 people getting on a train at Woking and going to Waterloo every morning, we're going to have 900 people getting in their cars and travelling around the M25 to their local serviced office. And that I'm not sure which is more sustainable, the train journey or the car journeys. So there's a big kind of discussion to be had around that, and that's all tied into this health and well-being thing anyway.
Can I just clarify one thing, Rob? When you say the ability to choose, do you mean the ability for people to choose how to design their job, or the choice to when to come to work, or the choice to the blend between sort of remote and office based?
It's the latter. It's choosing how and when they work.
Okay.
To allow caring, parenting, all these other things that go on behind the scenes to take place.
Okay. And Steve, from your point of view, do you see a drive towards bigger investment in health, well-being in the workplace?
Certainly will be from private organisations, whether it's landlords or the end occupiers. From government, and Rob might have a better answer, but I don't know. Apart from some macro stuff about, I don't know, encouraging cycling or something, I don't know if I were government what health and well-being initiative you could actually do. Like, if you had £1 billion and invested it in health and well-being in the workplace, I don't know what would be a good use of that money. It might be a good discussion between the three of us, but unless they put in loads of CO2 sensors and internal environment quality monitoring or something, which probably isn't a government necessity. I don't know where the government needs to do too much. It's more the organisations, and particularly with, as you were saying, with talent kind of shortage, you hope the kind of supply and demand curve means that businesses will be more welcoming and more accommodating, and providing better wellbeing packages for employees as an attraction aspect. So in an optimistic way, hopefully this means the incentives are aligned between employers and businesses and landlords to make offices and work life great, and government might not need to do too much. I don't know.
I think what's interesting, Steve, is the government have sort of invested money in CO2 monitoring and sensing in primary schools. So I think they're picking up on your point. I think they're starting to perhaps see a link, but I think that's more around COVID secure, COVID transmission in primary schools. So I think you're right. I think at the government level, they're probably yet to sort of make any connected drive towards well-being, but it'll be interesting to see what happens over the coming year or two. So, Steve, from an environmental point of view, do you think COP26 will make any difference and to current drive for net zero in buildings and associated infrastructure? Do you see any change in 2022 in the sort of net zero carbon sort of roadmap and agenda?
Yeah, there's going to be a whole raft of announcements from obviously government, but also, people like ourselves, different landlords, different developers have already got roadmaps to how they're getting to net zero by 2030 or 2040. I'm always conscious of there's the top developers and larger organizations, but there's a huge tail of organizations that don't do annual reporting or do anything, and they need government legislation to drive what they're doing.
Yeah.
The main thing in net zero is around, well, at least in new construction, it's embodied carbon, like the carbon from materials that are used. And there is absolutely zero legislation on that in any way, shape or form. And that's where government at the moment hasn't really done anything about it. But to answer your question, a lot of the larger organizations will be coming up with more and more robust plans of how they're going to get to net zero. How will it affect us in the day-to-day, or as employees, or as people working in offices? Probably won't see too much difference, because the last thing that landlords or any organization will do anything that impacts anyone's day-to-day life. Like at the moment, no one makes any sacrifice for the sake of sustainability. No one really stops eating burgers. No one really gets rid of their car. But what does happen is technology changes things, and the way where your energy comes from to your building, that will change because that's in the background and it doesn't affect anyone's day-to-day life. So I see a lot of changes in the background of buildings becoming more efficient and organizations doing stuff, but I don't think it'll be perceptible to the day-to-day person.
Okay, and Rob, from your point of view, do you see a continued push, an increase in the push to net zero carbon as a consequence of COP and what's happened over the last period?
Yeah, without question, and Steve's answered the question more fully than I can, but I can give perhaps a market perspective on this, which is I think that the pressure to achieve all this stuff will lead to the market differentiating. And picking up Steve's point about the long tail of developers and owners who don't care, effectively, is what you're saying. I think occupiers do care, and they got their own ESG targets, and they'll migrate now to those buildings which meet the targets, which do the things that they need to do to satisfy their own ESG targets. And there'll be a raft of buildings, I think. We'll have a secondary market of buildings now that don't come out anywhere close to these standards, and that's going to be the big tell for me in terms of how the market separates. I mentioned earlier about buildings having the lights on 7 days a week and only being used for 3. Well, we've got to think about that as a major that's a here and now issue. But yeah, I think there'll be a separation of the market in terms of the quality of buildings that people are prepared to take.
So yeah, I think that's quite an optimistic view, because we're expecting the market to differentiate and actually there to be a bit of pull from occupiers, which in turn will mean there'll be a drive and investment to create higher performing buildings, certainly from a net zero carbon point of view. So it'll be interesting to see how the tension between the sort of net zero carbon and the health and well-being piece sort of works out, because I think there's going to be a bit of tension there over the coming period. So moving to this talent shortage issue that we spoke about at the beginning. Post-Brexit, and as we emerge from COVID, we're seeing lots of examples on the news of shortages of butchers and HGV drivers, but it extends to all sectors of our economy. Steve, do you think, going forward, we're going to see the workplace play more and a more important part in the competition for talent and its retention?
Yeah, you can't win, can you? There's either high unemployment rates or AI is going to take over and steal all of our jobs to we don't have enough of them. Like I don't know what the sweet spot is, but we're never in the sweet spot. So it's, if you're going to choose one or the other, I guess you choose full employment and wages going up and supply and demand dictating that workers hopefully get better conditions because they have the power. But ultimately, if it gets too far, surely even in Brexit Britain, they'll just open up the borders eventually and let some Labour come in, and hopefully it's just a short-term problem because everyone wants delivery drivers or butchers, as you say. But overall, I can only see it as a positive thing where wages go up, like workers have more power. Owners of businesses want the right employees. They offer them better packages from a whole holistic viewpoint. But obviously it will suck, but prices will go up for us. Like we might have to pay more for the delivery or something, and inflation might get involved. But hopefully for the individual, they'll be better for it. But I'm not a Labour economist, so I don't really know.
Okay, thank you, Stephen. And Rob, from your point of view, do you see the workplace playing a larger part in, than it has in the past for the sort of acquisition and retention of talent?
Yeah, I do. I'm not sure where Brexit comes into this in terms of shortage, because for example, both America and Germany have higher per capita shortages of drivers, HGV, than we do. So I think we've got to be careful about the kind of terminology we use here. What we've had is a massive fundamental disruption in labour flow as a result of COVID. People that used to work on restaurants, for example, they went home and so on and so forth. And they went home from every country to their own country. So there's this massive disruption in labour flows. And for the reasons we all know, the confidence is not there yet to re-establish that. But they will be re-established at some point. As far as the office economy is concerned, we've said it already, really. The office has to become an attractor. And I'll say this anyway, not just because Steve's here, but you got somewhere like King's Cross. When I was a student, you didn't walk around that area because you could anything could happen to you. But now it's a fantastic place, and you've got the right buildings, the right occupiers, the right buzz, the right ambiance. It's all there. You've got transport, and that's what we've got to strive towards. And that's what successful workplaces will be in the future. They'll be networked, they'll be connected, they'll be together, they'll be placemaking, and above all, they'll be attracting people to them. Why would you go and work in an isolated building in, I'm going to say something here, so let's say some town in the suburbs of London, when you can work in King's Cross? It's a no-brainer. And if you're a Spanish graduate thinking, where do I want to go, to do my 2 years banking experience, London's, it's there. You go to the city or to King's Cross or something, because the attraction is so great. And that's what we've got to re-establish, the attraction of the workplace and the wider urban environment around that. Once we get back on that track, I think I'm like Steve. I'm quite optimistic.
And just building on what you've said there, Rob, the introduction of smart buildings, smart tech, apps to improve the sort of employee experience, the use of IoT, Internet of Things, wireless sensors. Do you see those evolving, accelerating over the sort of coming 12 months, building on what we've seen in the past?
Yeah, the measurement of building performance is becoming more and more and more important. We've been talking about it for quite a long time now, but I think there are indicators we're now taking it very seriously in terms of actually how buildings are used, how they're utilised, how they're performing over days and weeks and months. The overall consumption of energy that goes into them, and all this needs to be digitised now, and it's going to be. There's no question about it. So in the future, in 5 years down the line, 10 years down the line, we'll be able to press buttons and find out how all these buildings are working and whether they're measuring up on a daily basis to their obligations. So yeah, absolutely, fully 100% on that one.
And Steve, from your point of view, do you see the same theme?
Yeah, at the moment we put a load of tech into our buildings, but it hasn't. It's going to take a bit of a while. But I think there's a bit of a skills gap where facilities managers aren't data managers or data scientists. And I don't know if that will change in the short term. And then you end up paying, no offense, but consultants a fair amount of money. And then can they make the savings in energy to justify that expenditure? We probably can, because we're a sophisticated estate, but I can't imagine all offices paying for all this tech, paying for consultants. If it was part of facilities managers' day-to-day job and part of their remit and they have the skills to do it, absolutely fine. But I'm just finding a lot of people are expected to handle data who aren't data experts. And then the second point is, we'll have all the data about saying, by the way, your building was on at 3 a.m. But us as landlords want the people in the building to enjoy the building how they want. And if, say, Universal Music had a meeting with America at 3 a.m., we need to run that building. And until we get to the point in which you could run one bit of ventilation across one person, which might be the case in the future, typically you're going to have all the data, but it's human experience, which is a be all and end all. And that goes to my point about reaching our net zero targets. It's all well and good, but until people are ready to make a sacrifice by even putting on a jumper in the winter, or being happy to have less ventilation if you're the only one in the office, it's going to be very hard to make substantial changes. And that's what I worry about technology, is those 2 points where it's actually humans, well, in both instances, which are the barriers, not the technology.
Do you, Steve and Rob, do you have a view as to, what area of user experience in a building is most appropriate for disruption by technology, or is there something that comes to the fore in your mind? Is it as you said, Steve, is it about tailoring the environment to what you want? Is it about something else? Is there?
Maybe it's me, and maybe other people will have other views. But for me, I never want a world in which I have an app for my office, in which on that app I can select a desk, select the lighting, select the ventilation. Like, I've got too much other stuff going on. I don't want to do that. Like, just there's a landlord who decides what happens in the building, and you just go into it. Maybe I'm not fussy enough, but like, I've never been in the building and be like, oh, I could do another litre of air here, or like, I don't know. It's just whatever the building is doing, I'm fine. I'll adapt, and I'll put on a jumper if I need to. I don't know how many people really want an app and to get stuck into their building and change lighting levels, but there are different people. So yeah, I don't know if I was a building manager, if I'd spend loads of money on an app giving everyone the tools to change their environment, because inevitably it's never going to be sophisticated enough where the one person can make it ideal for them and ideal for their neighbour. But maybe I'm taking a dim view on technology, and I'd be interested to hear your views.
What do you think, Rob?
Well, you shouldn't really admit it, but I'm a bit of a technophobe myself, so I'm kind of there on that. But what I would say is that a friend of mine, Nigel Osland, who does similar things to what I do, he's just published a book called Beyond the Human Zoo. And I say it's not to plug Nigel's book, although that's probably going to be an effect. But the point is that Beyond the Human Zoo, it's saying we need to get away from these office environments where we keep people like we do. We used to keep animals in zoos. In other words, you put them in a sterile pen and expect them to get on with things. We've got to move to an environment where we're creating proper environments internally for people, which are biophilic, which are clean, which are healthy, which are managed intensively. So that doesn't mean just cleaning the surfaces once a day. It means cleaning them 5 times a day if necessary. But the point is, we're actually tending the environment and looking after it. The digital stuff, that's for monitoring and measuring and making sure things are right. But in terms of lived experience, we need to go beyond the zoo and the serried rows of clerical workers into a much more variegated environment that's healthy and interesting and attractive.
Yeah, agreed. And actually, on the zones thing, how would I prefer it is if there's a quiet zone in the corner of one corner of the office, a lively zone in another corner, a hot zone in one, and a cold zone. I don't know, like, then the individual doesn't need to change anything. It's the curated building manager who says, this is going to be a 23-degree area, and I'm going to make sure that it is 23 degrees, and because I'm actually monitoring it. So yeah, I guess all good technology is technology that you don't know is there, I suppose.
Good point. Very good point.
So perhaps what we need is sort of curated, adaptive, seamless solutions. So you walk in, you get a choice, and you can choose to go to an area, and in some way it adapts automatically to some preferences. So maybe that's what we need to see in the future. So Steve, moving on, what other issues do you think our audience today need to think about, and in terms of preparing for 2022? Is there in the world of workplace and buildings, is there anything beyond what we've already discussed?
No, I think that the main thing I can't really get my head around is that everyone will be in the office on like a Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and no one's in on a Monday or Friday. And I don't know how businesses will move with that. And on the downside of the labour shortage or talent shortage is that if businesses say, and I think they're well in their rights to say this, to come into the office, you have to be in the office 3, 4, or 5 days a week. The employees who rather like staying at home, who live 3 hours away, are going to say, no, I only want to be in the office 1 or 2 days. And then they'll just threaten to quit, and then they can just easily get another job. And I think it's far better for businesses to have people in the office space sharing ideas and being more productive and hopefully enjoying their lives a bit more. So I even had a discussion with a friend a couple of days ago on exactly that. He's moved out. He wants to be in the office 2 days a week. His employer wants him in 3 days a week, and he's got his way. And I'd be slightly annoyed if I was the employer. So I don't know how everyone will grapple with that, to be honest.
And from your perspective, Rob, what sort of other issues do you think people need to be thinking about?
Yeah, I agree with everything that Steve said, but just to provide something different, I think going forward, our industry talks to itself an awful lot. We have our own language, we talk to each other, and we need to stop thinking about things like assets. We need to stop thinking about square feet. We need to stop thinking about value in terms of asset value. We've got to move towards a service model. We've got to become, I said in another context recently, we want far fewer chartered surveyors and lots more hoteliers. We're here to provide a service now. The base building, it's like when you buy a new car, you don't expect it to go wrong. What you're looking for is the software that goes with it. Building's no different. That should all work. It should tick by. You shouldn't even need to worry about it. What you're interested in is the experience. And so we as an industry have to get our heads around the fact we are a service-based provider as well as the old-fashioned asset provider. And the sooner we get on that track, the better, frankly.
Okay, thank you, Rob. So my final question before I turn to picking up some questions from the floor that we've had in the chat. Steve, what one bit of advice would you give to those listening to us today to concentrate on in terms of making the biggest impact in 2022 in workplaces and buildings for the people and organizations?
Just to quote Nike, just do it. A decision made is, whether it's good or bad, is always better than not making a decision. And just be bold, and the ones that are bold and actually go with what should be done will be the ones that survive. The ones that dither will be left behind, is the best advice I can think of, even though it's quite generic.
I think that's really good, Steve. Thank you. And Rob, from your point of view?
Well, having had 30 seconds to think of it, what I would suggest is that we all question our own roles. If you look to yourself and ask yourself, what do I need to do differently in March 2022 that I wasn't doing, what I was doing in March 20, and then address that in terms of what you deliver to the industry. I think that would be a massive step forward, because we all have to recognise that we all have to change to some degree or another. So question your own role is my message.
Okay, thank you very much, Rob. So just picking up a couple of the questions that we've had as we've chatted through. First one is, so there's a lot of confusion about what a healthy working environment is. Some people say it's free food, some people say it's sodas, beanbags, and so on. I mean, Rob, do you have a view as to what a healthy working environment is?
Yeah, I do, but probably too much to squeeze into this next 30 seconds, but it's not about beanbags, because that myth has been exploded once we recognise that we've got both introverts and extroverts in the office. We need to cater for everybody's needs. So a healthy workplace, in summary, is one that caters to diversity and provides both the nutrition and the background environmental conditions to keep everybody safe and happy.
Okay, thank you. And Steve, from your point of view, do you have a view as to what constitutes a healthy working environment?
Yeah, so I think the technical stuff around the internal environment quality monitoring is just hygiene. It's just the basic level that should be provided. It should be good ventilation, should be good temperature, should be good daylight, should even be biophilia, arguably, as like a baseline. And then it's the human elements that are layered upon it, whether that happens to be beanbags for certain people, or activities in the office, or a free bar, or a free kitchen with healthy food. But yeah, I see them as two separate things, I guess.
Okay, thank you. And there's another question which picks up on one of the points we discussed around sort of flexible working and how that works. So I guess the question comes down to how do you balance the needs of the employee and the employer in this new world of agile working? And you alluded to this, Steve, in terms of the conversation between your friend and their employer, one wanting 2 days a week, the other wanting 3. There may not be an easy answer to this, but do you have a view as to how you moderate or deal with that sort of tension where somebody in one part of their career may want one model, somebody in a different part of their career might want a different model? So, Steve, your thoughts?
Yeah, Argent have so a huge engineering consultancy with, I don't know, 10,000 employees or something, have moved to complete flexible working. You can work, you do your 38 or 40 hours or whatever, but you can do it anytime during the week. I have no idea how they manage that, whether people clock in and clock out or just do timesheets. And I don't know how it works for their clients, but I think they just trust their employees to know that they know where they need to be at certain times. And that sounds like a healthy model. And then it's up to the individual to know that if they just decided to work from midnight to 6 a.m., they're probably not going to get on very well with their clients or their co-workers, and they need to adapt it themselves. But recognizing that they're a firm full of clever professionals, they can make decisions for themselves, and that trust is there. And some people might abuse it, but then frankly, they're not going to get promoted, or they'll just get fired. So I feel like that's a relatively good model where you hope if they want to be a good employee, they'll work with sensible hours, but give themselves flexibility when they know if there's an amazing cricket game on in the afternoon, like this afternoon, they can take that off and then make up the hours in the early hours of tomorrow morning. I think that's a great approach. And I think flexible working has been quite binary at the moment, where it's like, either you're in the office or out of the office. But the working hours aspect of it, from my perspective, I haven't seen too much flexibility around that yet. So I applaud Argent for making that step. I don't know how it works from a workspace perspective, whether they open their office 24 hours, 24/7. But yeah, I see that as quite a positive model.
Okay, thank you, Stephen. And Rob, from your point of view, how do you think we sort of square that tension?
Well, we used to talk pre-COVID an awful lot about the role of the workplace in supporting corporate culture. Corporate culture was a major thing. You know, all the worker bees pointing in the same direction for the same goals and achieving the same outcomes. And that was a bit rigid, but in essence, it was a really important message. And I fear in the Argent model that we're going to lose some of that, and the job becomes a contract, not a career. And I also worry about the demographics of it in terms of where young people come into this. You know, people coming into the workplace, how do they get onboarded? How do they get inculcated with the culture? How do you understand the system, the process, the individuals? How do you pick up intelligence, you know, in the office? And there are people who need to be in the office and want to be in the office because they want to, you know, not home for everybody is not always a comfortable place, frankly. It can be kind of a different kind of place. So we've got to manage this in a very subtle kind of way. And it's not, as Steve said, an either or. It's a mix of, I think HR departments now have to step up and move away from the hire and fire model into a much more workplace culture management model. Because if we're having people scattered around 4 corners of the country and beyond, as Argent suggested, for example, managing that is a huge issue.
Okay, thank you, Rob. Steve, it looked like you were going to come back on that.
No, I totally agree. I don't know whether there's a part of self-determinism or, if you're meant to be managing your younger employees and you don't do that, then maybe not fired, but you should be told by your superior saying you have a responsibility here to teach your graduates what you know and pass on that knowledge. So please try to be in the office when they're in the office. That's part of your job description. So it's not saying you need to be in the office at certain times. It's just saying your job description is to guide these younger employees. And equally, the younger employees, you can work wherever you want, but you won't get very far if you don't come in the office and learn from your superiors. So it's more that, and if they do decide to work from home because that works for them and they don't really like the office, it's informing them that their career might stall and you might not be as fully rounded as you might be. And so I think it's an education piece of, yes, working from home is nice, and yes, sometimes it's difficult to drag yourself onto the tube in the middle of the morning or get in the car and commute, but actually those little interactions you have which you don't appreciate at the time will get you further in your career, and sometimes you just don't appreciate that when you work from home.
Okay, thank you, Stephen. I'm just going to draw us to a close, and we've covered a lot of ground over the last 50 minutes or so. But if I tried to sort of summarise our discussion, I guess what we're saying is 2022 is going to be a continuation of a lot of what we've seen in 2021, and I think we're suggesting that people need to take the themes that emerged and the issues and the challenges and the tensions and get on and think about how that's resolved. We're not going to see the death of the office. We're not going to see the death of real estate. We're going to see it emerge and adapt, perhaps more quickly over the next 12 months to what's come before over the previous period. And building on what you said previously, Rob, March 2020 wasn't day zero. It's a day in the life of what we all do. And then just drawing it to a close, what you said, Rob, is we all need to question our own roles and how we're adding value in March 2022 over what we were doing in March 2020 and before. And I liked Steve's plagiarism of Nike's suggestion. Just do it. And those who don't are likely to fall by the wayside. So our advice is to get out and adapt, try out what is going to resolve the tensions in your organization and tweak to suit as we move into 2022 and beyond. So I'm just going to close there. Hopefully you feel I've done a reasonable service in trying to summarize our conversation, but people can flick back through the recording and view it at their leisure. I'm just going to close by thanking Rob Harris and Steve Kellett for your contributions today. I've really enjoyed our conversation, as will have our audience. So in closing, those who joined us today and are watching the recording can access the material that we discussed and a copy of the recording on our website and channels. Our next webinar will be at the beginning of December, and we'll share with everybody the date and the topic over the coming week or two. And just in closing, once again, to thank Rob and Steve for your time today. I've really enjoyed our conversation, as will have our audience. So thank you and goodbye.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Rob. Thanks, Steve.